Good morning, Asia. Good evening, United States. And for the very few courageous people from Europe, good night. My name is Bert Hoffman. I'm the director of the East Asian Institute, and we're delighted to have David Dollar for our distinguished public lecture this morning. David Dollar is a very distinguished expert in Asia development, in US-Asia policies, relations, and he is also a former colleague of mine at the World Bank. David is currently the distinguished senior fellow in the China Center of the Brookings Institution. Before, he was the Treasury representative of the United States in Beijing. And before that, he worked for 20 years at the World Bank, finishing up as the country director of the World Bank in China. His history with China goes back even further. For the first time, he was in the mid-'80s, and he spent half a year, I believe, at the China Academy of Social Sciences to teach, and that's also where he learned Chinese and where he met his wife. So that was a very important step for him. Today's topic is also a very important topic and a very timely topic. China's domestic and international challenges. This is a time where China is formulating its coming 5-year plan, the 14th 5-year plan. Is looking at a new development paradigm, of course, has to deal with tensions, international tensions as well, and has both domestic challenges and the international challenges. And of course, we have noticed that there is a new administration in the United States, which will bring a new China policy. And for that, China has to prepare as well. Without further ado, please, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bert. It's really a great pleasure to see you and hopefully connect with other old friends who are out there in the cyber audience. I'm going to talk about the challenges that China's economy faces, both domestic and international. I'll try to divide things fairly evenly because, as Bert said, there's a new US administration, and that raises interesting speculation about what the international economic environment is going to be like from China's point of view. But I'm going to start by talking about some domestic challenges. Now, as background, everyone knows the basic story that China has grown at roughly 10% per year for 4 decades, very impressive success story, but naturally the growth slows down as you move into middle income. So in recent years, growth has trended down more towards 6%, and that partly reflects that as you catch up, there are fewer opportunities to continue to catch up, and there's also diminishing marginal returns to capital as China has very impressively accumulated capital. So there are lots of reasons why the growth rate tends to slow down. The question is, how much is China's growth rate going to slow down? And probably most important, what are some of the policies that can counteract that tendency and keep up a healthy growth rate into the future? So I'm going to emphasize a number of areas that lead to natural policy conclusions. And I'm going to start with first this very serious demographic challenge that China faces. It's, I think, a very interesting story. Chairman Mao was in favor of a large population. He encouraged population growth when he was the head of the Communist Party. And China's population did grow very rapidly in the 50s and 60s. And that then naturally turned into labor force growth in the 1970s, 1980s, into the 1990s. But when Deng Xiaoping started the Kaifang, the economic reform in 1978, around the same time, the thinking of the leadership changed. They were worried that they had just created a very large poor population. China was 80% rural at that point. And so you were getting a growing amount of people in an area where you didn't really have enough arable land for all these people to be wealthy if they were going to be living as farmers. China has about 1/5 of the world's population, but only 7% of the world's arable land. So together with economic reform, we got the one-child policy. And fertility came down very dramatically in China. I don't want to overemphasize the importance of the one-child policy, because fertility has come down in all the successful Asian developers, economies like Taiwan, South Korea. I'm not so much of an expert on Singapore, but I believe you've had a very impressive drop in fertility. This seems natural in these successful industrializing economies that are pretty densely populated. So some combination of natural development impact plus the one-child policy brought about a really extreme decline of fertility in China. And what that did was it created this contrast between a period where the labor force was growing very, very rapidly. The share of children in the economy was going down. There weren't that many old people. So you had big labor force relative to dependence. And that was one of the contributions to China's rapid growth. But the problem then is that naturally comes to an end. You now basically have a labor force that's peaked, at least the working age population is peaked and is starting to decline, and is probably going to decline pretty significantly over the next couple of decades. China has changed its policy towards childbearing, but if it's like other Asian economies, we're not likely to see any big increase in fertility. So China probably has this decline in the labor force baked in. So it got a demographic dividend during the first couple decades after the change in fertility policy, and now it's facing this pretty dramatic decline in the labor force. Looking out over the next couple of decades, the number of people over 65 will double from 200 million to 400 million. Probably more important, the number of people, the so-called super old, over 85 years old, they're going to increase from fewer than 50 million today to more than 150 million by 2049. So very dramatic increase in an elderly population that will need to be cared for in an environment in which the labor force will be declining. Now, while the labor force will be declining, it's interesting that one particular cohort will be increasing. The people who are 55 to 64 years old will actually increase very dramatically, and I think roughly double their share of the labor force. So China is going to be depending on a lot of workers in that 55 to 64-year-old age group, and that can potentially be a good thing because these are relatively senior, experienced workers. On the other hand, it can also present some challenges if China needs to retrain people to move from one industry to another. So this is going to be one of the important factors influencing growth. And the last thing I'll say about demographics is there's some thinking that the demographic change may match very nicely what's going to happen with robotics and automation in China. China is introducing robots at a more rapid rate than anyone else. It's very impressive. It's leading to automation in some key industries. So in theory, you might have jobs wiped out by automation just as the labor force is declining, and it can all be a kind of happy equilibrium. And I'm a little skeptical about this because the experience with automation is it doesn't hit the whole economy evenly. There'll be particular industries and particular occupations where there'll be lots of automation. So you know how in China you've got different cities that specialize in different products. You can easily imagine some city in Guangdong where a big fraction of jobs are wiped out by automation. Meanwhile, there are other locations that focus on service sectors where there's very little automation going on, and yet people will be retiring there because of this demographic change. So I like to think very concretely, that's the kind of challenge that China will be facing, is there may be a lot of people thrown out of work in particular locations and industries doing certain tasks. And then there's going to be labor shortages in other locations for other skills. And managing that potentially can create a lot of friction for economic growth. Certainly, things you can do to facilitate retraining of workers, making sure everyone has basic high level of human capital, social safety net policies, because there will be situations where a lot of people are thrown out of work quickly. All of that is very important. Now, a second topic I want to take up is closely related to the first one, and that's the rural-urban divide. According to Chinese statistics, the country's only about 60% urbanized, and that is including the migrant workers. So counting people where they live, not their hukou registration, China's about 60% urbanized, and it has the potential to go quite a bit higher, more like 80% would be normal for its stage of development and its population density. And this can be, potentially this can help mitigate the first problem I brought up, because it does seem that there's still a significant population in the countryside that could move to the cities, contribute to the urban labor force as people there age and retire. But a lot of that rural population consists of children and elderly. And I don't know if they're exact statistics, and I confess I didn't track them down, but since 60% of the country is urban, including the migrants, about 300 million migrants now, most of the migrants are of working age and are working, right? And to me, that suggests that a majority of children and a majority of the elderly are living in the countryside. The fact that a majority of the elderly are living in the countryside, that in some sense exacerbates the challenge of dealing with the elderly. You're going to need a lot more resources for health and for elder care. And frankly, urban living is more efficient in a lot of ways. So you're probably going to have retired people who want to move to cities where their working age children are employed. And you still have various blockages in China that make it difficult to move around. The hukou registration system is breaking down, and there's continual talk about reforming it. But I think it is still an obstacle to that rural population moving to cities. And also, you've got this big difference between the rural education system and the urban education system. But most of the children are going to school in the countryside, and you're going to need them as workers in the future. So putting more resources into rural education, rural health, increasing mobility between urban and rural areas. And frankly, the highest productivity comes from people moving to the flagship cities, and that's where migration still tends to be fairly restricted. So I think there's an agenda of continuing to dismantle the registration system. Ultimately, you want to unify the urban and rural health, education, pension, safety net policies, and that's going to help obviously reduce the rural-urban divide, and it will also help manage that demographic challenge. Now, a third domestic challenge is that Chinese growth has relied a lot on investment. That's been true most of the time since the economic reform began, but it's been particularly true since the global financial crisis. China's response to the global crisis, this is the 2008-2009 crisis, was a big stimulus program aimed primarily at investment. And I think it was quite successful in addressing the crisis, but the stimulus was almost completely focused on investment, probably went on too long. And so it's led to over construction of investment, over construction of the capital stock in some sectors, in some locations. And the main evidence for this is if you look at leverage indicators, indicators of debt relative to the whole economy, or I prefer to break it down, really just focus on the debt of the corporate, the non-financial corporate sector relative to GDP. That ratio of leverage was pretty stable during what I think of as the golden age of China's growth from about 2000 to 2008 till we got that financial crisis. But after 2009, there's been a big increase in leverage, and that's a sign that many bad investments are being financed. If you finance good investments, that contributes to GDP growth, and the ratio of debt to GDP should be stable or rising very slowly. If you finance unproductive investment, you get the debt, but you do not get enough impact on growth, on GDP, and so that debt to GDP ratio rises, and that is an indicator of risks building up in the financial system. Now, the government's aware of this, and ironically, before the pandemic hit, China had actually made quite a bit of progress stabilizing leverage and reducing these financial risks. But then with 2020 was essentially, at least the first half of the year, was clearly a recession for the Chinese economy. First and second quarter, obviously very difficult economic conditions with the pandemic and the lockdown. And so you had some relaxation of monetary and credit policies, and we saw another jump in leverage early in 2020. Once again, I think the authorities are aware of this, and as the Chinese economy now seems to be recovering back to its growth trend, I think we'll see the government gradually reining in the growth of credit, getting control of this leverage. The issue for development is that we've already talked about how the labor force is likely to decline. This tightening of monetary policy or trying to rein in wasteful investment is going to slow down the growth of the capital stock. And there really are only three sources of growth on the supply side. There's labor force growth, growth in the capital stock, and then there's technological innovation, or what we often call total factor productivity growth. So in China, growth of labor force will be negative. Growth of the capital stock is very likely to slow down. And then the only way to really balance that and maintain a healthy growth rate is through innovation. And you hear a lot of talk in China about trying to increase innovation. You've got a lot of positives. China's turning out millions of STEM graduates every year. It's spending nearly 3% of GDP on research and development. It's obviously had some success in particular sectors, but the overall output from Chinese research efforts is really not that impressive, particularly in terms of the bottom line, which is productivity growth for the whole economy. We actually don't see much, if any, productivity growth for the whole macro economy in recent years. So there can be some individual innovation successes, but it's not, doesn't seem to be permeating the economy and really lifting the productivity of the whole economy. As China prepares its next 5-year plan, I perceive there to be a pretty active debate about how to make the economy more innovative. And at the risk of oversimplification, I think there's a tendency to see, I see two camps. So there's one group that is more, you might call them techno-nationalistic. They want to close off some sectors, or at least some sectors of the Chinese economy from the world economy, limit foreign investment and competition in key sectors. channel resources to state enterprises to do research and develop new technologies. A very kind of heavy-handed industrial policy approach. And then I think there's another group that I see focusing more on the foundation of innovation. I already mentioned the STEM graduates spending money on research and development. Other key ingredients would be strengthening intellectual property rights protection so that there's an incentive for private firms in particular to innovate. Most of the patents in China are actually going to private firms. So R&D resources may be going to state enterprises, but the actual output of patents is primarily coming from private firms. So there's some hope in taking that approach of strengthening the foundation. And then I think while the first group is kind of instinctively protectionist, trying to develop Chinese technologies within a protected environment, the other group that focuses more on the foundation of innovation, that's a group that's leading the charge on opening up the economy more. And I'm encouraged that there have been some very important developments. Since Joe Biden was elected president, China has signed two major agreements. RCEP agreement with ASEAN plus Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, which is, I think, quite a significant trade liberalization effort. And then right before the end of the calendar year, China reached an agreement with the European Union on an investment treaty. And I think some of the details have still to be worked out, but the basic idea is to open up more of the Chinese economy to 100% foreign-owned subsidiaries and create a more stable environment for foreign investment. And I might just add, that obviously hasn't gone into effect yet, but 2020 was interesting in that was the first year where China surpassed the United States as the largest recipient of direct foreign investment in the world. China has been number 2 for quite a while behind the US, which perennially has been number 1. But last year, direct investment into the US fell by about 50%. It fell very dramatically in Europe as well. In China, there was only a small increase over 2019, but still it was an increase in an environment of global recession. And that shows the attractiveness of the Chinese production environment. So I'm going to be looking carefully at the details of the 5-year plan. I'm sure there are going to be elements of both. You never get clean policy decisions from any government, as far as I can see. So I'm sure there'll be some nod toward industrial policy to develop particular technologies. But I'm also going to be looking for further trends toward opening the economy, improving intellectual property rights, trying to create a more level playing field between the private sector and state enterprises. But I think that's a tension we're going to continue to see in China, that the leadership naturally wants to channel resources to the state enterprises, but they're not very innovative and productive. And so that's not likely to be a very successful growth path for China. Now, let me turn to the international environment. I've already indirectly touched on a couple of important aspects of the international environment, which is China participating in the ASEAN-led RCEP agreement and reaching this investment treaty with the Europeans. But what has been difficult for China for a number of years now has been its economic relationship with the US. And it's natural for us to be wondering and speculating about what's likely to happen now that President Biden has taken over. Let me say that the trade war that we saw coming from the Trump administration, it had both macro and micro issues or aspects. President Trump was very concerned about the bilateral trade balance between the US and China. Economists like myself, we don't really pay attention to bilateral trade balance. It doesn't really signify much of anything. And the overall trade balance, which is important if it gets too far away from balance, that's more a reflection of macro policies than of trade policies. It's a fallacy to think that import tariffs, I mean, the main instrument that the US administration was using, continues to use, would be import tariffs aimed at China. It's a fallacy to think that that's going to improve the US trade balance, because the tariffs tend to reduce US imports below what they would otherwise be, but they also reduce US exports. And in theory and in history, we actually don't see much evidence that protectionism affects the trade balance. So that was somewhat misguided right from the start, thinking that the trade balance was going to be affected. Let me, there's so many different issues, so I want to try to maintain some clarity as I go along. Let me just say on this trade balance issue, the outcome after a couple years of trade war is the US trade deficit with China actually went up during 2020. And as I already said, I don't really particularly think that's important, but it was an objective and we now know the result. And then the overall US trade deficit actually went up quite significantly during 2020, from about $50 billion per month to $65 billion per month, which is pretty, what is that, about a 30% increase. So that was pretty significant. So the whole macro thing, it was A, misguided, because you can't use these trade tools, and B, it's gone the opposite direction of what the US administration was pursuing. But then having said that, I think to be fair, the main concern, certainly the main concern of Robert Lighthizer, who was the trade representative, main concern was a set of micro issues about market access, restrictions on FDI, either having to work through 50-50 joint ventures or whole sectors closed. Remember, the largest firms of the United States are just not able to operate in China at all, right? The biggest firms are Google, Facebook, Twitter. These firms are not allowed to operate in China at all. So the US definitely has some legitimate market access concerns, plus concern about intellectual property rights protection, forced technology transfer. So there was a set of micro issues around which the US has been negotiating with China for a long time. I had some personal involvement with that from 2009 to 2013. And I think looking back, my assessment is we didn't make a lot of progress in terms of China opening up its economy more over the last 10 years or so. I did just highlight the importance of the RCEP agreement and the EU investment treaty. So perhaps there are some key changes coming, but up until, and both of those were just agreed in the last couple months, up until then, I think we did not see a lot of progress in opening up the Chinese economy and dealing with these so-called structural issues. So the Trump administration imposed a 25% tariff. It was introduced in phases. A little bit of it was pulled back, but I think of it as roughly covering about half of US imports from China. And 25% tariff is a pretty serious obstacle. In light of that, it's quite remarkable when we look at the actual 2020 outcome, is that US imports from China went up by 8% last year. So despite pandemic and recession, and despite a 25% tariff on half of imports, US imports from China went up 8%, which is a pretty big percentage increase for a big economy. So I find that quite remarkable. I mean, it's consistent with the argument that I and others have made that the tariffs were not a particularly good instrument for the US to be using. So they obviously didn't achieve their objective. That it's a tax paid by American people and American firms. It does throw a certain amount of sand in the wheels. So while, as I just said, we imported more from China, but the pattern was distorted to some extent. The tariffs did not apply to popular electronic products like laptops, tablets, smartphones. And that's a lot of what the US has been importing, plus a certain amount of protective equipment related to the pandemic. But I think the electronics are the main thing. I'm talking to you from my home. Lots of Americans are working from home, and many people purchased additional electronic equipment of different types to facilitate their working remotely. And China makes a lot of that stuff. So America imported more of that stuff. Now, the tariffs, as I said, they did throw some sand in the wheels of certain industries. It used to be that almost all the Christmas lights in America were imported from China. And the 25% tariff did apply to Christmas lights. So it's an interesting natural experiment. So what happened? So what happened was Chinese producers moved a lot of the production to Cambodia. And the US ended up importing all of its Christmas lights. Almost all of its Christmas lights came from Cambodia in 2020. But a lot of those are coming from Chinese firms or other international firms, and they had components coming from China. So it's kind of a minor distortion. In order to avoid the tariff, some production went through Cambodia, but it's not that big a distortion. China exported more to Cambodia, so it didn't really hurt China that much. American consumers had to pay a little bit more for these products because this is a kind of inefficiency, but it really didn't have that much effect. So I think and then let me say that I was just narrowly focusing on the tariffs and the trade aspect of the trade war for a moment. There's also simultaneously what you might call a technology war. You've got measures aimed at Huawei concerning the export of US semiconductors and other components. You have a number of other firms that are put on what the US calls the entity list that affects the ability of American firms to sell components or other things to them. More recently, the Defense Department has come up with a list of firms that are closely connected to the Chinese military. And it's a list that includes some genuine defense contractors, but it also includes the three big telecom companies, China Mobile and the other two, CNOOC, the offshore oil company. CNOOC has a joint venture with ExxonMobil. It owns gas and oil leases in the United States. China Mobile is included in popular indices of developing country stocks. So if you buy the most popular exchange traded fund in the US that invests in the developing world, you are indirectly investing in China Mobile, some of the other countries on this list, companies on this list. So, and the import of this new list is that Americans are supposed to not buy stocks of these companies and to divest any shares that you have. So you've got a different types of measures, all aimed at what are essentially security technology issues. So then President Biden comes in And I would say he inherits a somewhat difficult situation. As a candidate, he was critical of the tariffs, and his team, key people in his team have been critical of the tariffs in term as a bad instrument, kind of consistent with what I was arguing a few minutes ago, that it's not really a good instrument to try to pursue what the US administration is pursuing. But given that the tariffs are in place, Biden has said he's not going to quickly unilaterally just remove the tariffs. Now that they're in place, potentially he's going to negotiate with China to reduce those in return for structural reforms on the Chinese side. But I think the main thing we're hearing after just 1 week of this administration is that they're going to take their time to work out the details of China policy. So Janet Yellen and the US Treasury, they just froze that regulation that I was describing about Americans not investing in the companies that had been put on this list by our Department of Defense. I would say, in some sense, that's a kind of neutral decision. It's basically saying, we're putting a hold on that. And I happen to know they were getting a lot of complaints from Wall Street about this was confusing. It didn't make any sense. It was causing a lot of problems in trading, and kind of what's the point? So the Treasury Department has frozen that, and they're going to look at it. I think they set a time frame of about 6 months. They're going to look at all of these different technology-related sanctions, not just the Treasury Department, because other departments are relevant. And I'm pretty sure what will happen is there will be first a review of all these different measures, and then there'll be an interagency discussion at a high level. So you get Treasury and Commerce, State Department, Defense, National Security Advisor, and in the end, the president's going to make a decision. So first, what we can be pretty sure of is there'll be a lack of clarity for 6 months or so. And then second, my own speculation is the outcome of this kind of review is likely to be rolling back some of the measures, because some of them seem poorly thought out and already creating a certain amount of trouble. On this issue of who can invest in Chinese companies, this doesn't hurt the Chinese companies because money's fungible. So if you make Americans sell out of some of these companies, take China Mobile as an example. So if Americans have to sell out, being forced to do something, probably puts them at something of a disadvantage. And then foreigners are going to buy up those shares. And it's not going to make a difference to the Chinese companies, but you are restricting the ability of American investors, to be involved in those companies. And there probably are some security cases, some cases of defense contractors where you really do want to restrict that. But I suspect this kind of review is going to decide that some of the things that were put in place really do not make sense for the United States. So on the technology side, I think we'll get some fine tuning of the policies within 6 months or so, but not immediately. And then on the trade side, I should also add, President Biden and his team have emphasized that they want to go out and consult with allies. And one of the things they want to consult about is economic policy toward China. And I think it's pretty clear what they're going to hear. Angela Merkel's been very clear. She was the one pushing for this investment treaty between the EU and China. And she's been very clear that she does not endorse an effort to build some kind of coalition against China. Plus, I know the Europeans are upset about the US use of tariffs, which violate WTO, violate international law, which the Europeans take very seriously. So what the Biden team is going to hear back is they don't want to be part of a new Cold War with China, and they think the US should get back into compliance with the WTO, not use these tariffs. And I think when President Biden consults with South Korea and Japan and other allies, Singapore, other allies in Asia, I know he's going to hear they don't want to have to choose between China and the US, particularly in the economic realm. You know, they prefer an integrated trade and investment regime where all of our partners are more deeply integrated with China than they are with the United States. So they want to do business with China. They want to invest and trade, and they don't want to be part of a Cold War effort to isolate China. So I think it'll take a while, but I think if the Biden team is serious about listening to allies, you know, they're going to hear some sensible things. Asian partners are also going to tell the U.S. to rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I don't see that happening quickly. Another point, another obvious point I should just put out there is Biden is going to focus on getting the virus under control, rolling out the vaccine, recovery of the U.S. economy. That has to be the priority for the first 6 to 9 months. So any kind of significant trade agreement, I think, is not on the agenda during most of 2021. And so the optimistic scenario for globalization is that by early 2022, Biden has heard enough from different allies. The US economy does look well positioned to rebound. I mean, the virus has been handled very poorly, but the IMF is forecasting a better rebound for the US than for other advanced economies, because US companies have done surprisingly well, cutting costs, adjusting, and we have a significant unemployment problem at the moment, but there's already a lot of fiscal firepower that's been approved, and I'm pretty confident that Biden will get an additional package, maybe not 1.9 trillion, probably closer to 1 trillion, but I think together with what was passed in December, that's some serious firepower to take care of rolling out the vaccine, reopening schools, unemployment insurance is needed. So some of the, and helping local and state governments that have not been, they're not allowed to borrow. So there are quite a few local governments in difficult circumstances. As an aside, I'm not really a big fan of these checks that they're handing out indiscriminately. So the latest proposal includes about $500 billion of handing out checks. The easy way to pare this thing down is not to hand out the checks, make a few other adjustments. You could probably bring this thing to about $1 trillion. So I think Biden's got a very daunting domestic set of challenges, and he's serious about going out and consulting with allies. And so I think the US is simply not going to get around to dealing with China for a while. Unfortunately, from my point of view, they're going to leave the tariffs in place while that's happening. But as I indicated, they're really not that big a distortion. I don't want to be too cavalier about the tariffs because I think it was a terrible precedent. But the actual distortion, if you stopped right here, is not that great. To me, the risk was everybody starts raising tariffs and then the costs become very serious. So I've gone on a little bit longer than I wanted to, but I think we still have plenty of time for Q&A. But let me just briefly summarize that China has this, like other countries, it's got some very serious domestic challenges, and it's facing an international environment that's not that friendly. But I did emphasize these important agreements with RCEP and the Europeans. And the ASEAN has moved into first place as China's #1 trading partner. And so in some ways, this is the way the world's going. More economic activity, certainly in Asia, and then a lot of potential for trade and investment between Asia and Europe. And then we're going to have to see, I remain optimistic that with a bit of a lag, the US will get back into international trade agreements and work out a new deal with China. But everyone has to be patient. It's not going to happen quickly. Bert, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, David, and thanks for giving such a great overview of the policies that are ahead of in two very complicated countries. We already have a number of questions coming in. Please use the Q&A button to ask more questions. Unfortunately, we got so many people online that we can't do it individually. But I started with a question on my own. And regarding the 14 5-year plan, the upcoming 5-year plan, the guidance of the party put a lot of emphasis on the dual circulation. Now, there's a number of elements in that. You touched upon a couple of them, including continued opening up, including domestic innovation, but two you haven't talked about. One was a further extension of domestic supply chains, and the second, expansion of domestic demand, and particularly consumption demand. Now, these are two things that the first one sounds a bit like import substitution, and I'd like to hear your view on that. But the second is something that, David, when you and I work together, we already tried to get consumption up, and it still hasn't really happened. So what needs to happen to get more domestic demand, especially consumption in China? Thanks.
All right, thanks, Bert. So this is a really good question. I had scribbled down on my notes, I had written dual circulation and circled it, but I forgot to bring it up, partly because I find it hard to really sink my teeth into what exactly is meant by dual circulation, but you help by taking two concrete elements. So as you say, I think the second one we can heartily endorse. I would say there is some progress. You know, the consumption has been the main source of growth in China for a while. You know, if you break down the sources from the demand side, consumption has been the main source of growth for a number of years. Now, of course, that flipped in 2020. Once again, you did have a pretty big investment-focused stimulus, but up until 2020, the most recent IMF World Economic Outlook has a really interesting figure where they decompose global growth quarter by quarter, you know, and the global growth has got a lot of different components. But what jumps out is that the growth of private consumption in China is the single biggest source of demand, new demand for global growth. So it's true, it's remains, you know, as a share of Chinese GDP, it remains a little bit on the low side, and we're frustrated it hasn't grown more quickly, but it has grown somewhat. And, you know, given China's overall growth rate, it is a very impressive source of demand for the world. And I guess without repeating myself, I think some of the things I discussed, many of which are things you and I have discussed for a long time, you know, the unifying the rural-urban education, pension, health systems. I mean, truly unifying is an ideal, but, you know, bringing them closer together, that would require a lot more government consumption, and then I think it would have a spillover effect on private consumption. Certainly, the mobility issue I discussed. Now, the first issue you brought up, you know, I think to be fair, you can have efficient import substitution. What we've seen is Chinese value chains in China, the value chains that are in China have definitely lengthened over the last 10 years or so. So I often argue that, you know, China is moving up into the middle of a lot of value chains. So my little example from Cambodia, you know, the tariffs may have accelerated that, but that was going to happen. You know, the final assembly on those Christmas lights is a very simple, labor-intensive work, you know, but there are other components involved in those that are somewhat more sophisticated. And so I think that's one reason why this whole tariff strategy is pretty hopeless, you know, because you end up pushing some of the final assembly to Vietnam or Cambodia. You know, that's nice for them, but China is going to be exporting a lot of content. Anyway, but as far as the problem with the Chinese idea is that as they become more sophisticated, if they were following in the path of, say, South Korea, what would happen is they would be shedding more and more of those labor-intensive activities. So in some sense, they're if you think of there being 10 steps in the value chain, they don't, natural thing is not to be taking over more and more steps. It's to be moving into the more sophisticated steps and having others move to other countries. And that would obviously be good for Asian integration if they had that kind of a concept. So I do worry a little bit that it's not a good concept, and that the natural way to actually bring it about, if you take it seriously, is through protection. And that goes against the spirit of these agreements that they've signed.
Thanks, David. In your talk, you said that, look, the chances of the U.S. Joining CPTPP anytime soon are pretty low. Bart Edes, former ADB head in Washington, you probably came across him.
I know Bart, yeah.
So he asked, what about China? There's some talk that they would join. What are the chances of that, and how do you see that? If so, what would need to happen?
I mean, when Japan kept it alive, which I think Japan should get a lot of credit for, they switched off a number of provisions that were controversial, which, some of which I don't particularly like, so switching them off was a good thing. But still, it's a pretty heavy lift for China to join the CPTPP. So to be honest, I think China's talk about it was a little bit more rhetorical. Policymakers kind of throwing out, well, maybe we could join, I think it would be a smart strategy for them, but it would be a heavy lift in terms of managing domestic interest groups. And then you quickly get into politics, Bert. If China seriously went to Japan and said, we would like to join, but here are a couple of things that you would have to change. And that group might rationally decide they were willing to make some changes for China. But then the US will come down very hard on Japan. And so I just think politically, I don't see Japan, leading a group that on an activity that would clearly annoy the United States. And on the other hand, and I'm not quite, maybe I didn't choose my words carefully enough, but I don't think anything could possibly happen in 2021. But as we get into 2022, if the US economy is roaring back and Biden is hearing what I think he's going to hear from allies, he has talked even fairly recently about looking for some changes in the TPP and rejoining. So I don't rule it out in 2022. I think it's more likely neither one. I wouldn't take an even money bet on either one. But I think it's more likely the US would join before China.
I believe it would then be called the CPTIP, because the Indo-Pacific hasn't changed. What also hasn't changed, and this is really a question of Alessandro Ardrini, is on this core tech issue. Yes, maybe Trump went a little bit overboard, but if you think that to some extent China and the US are systemic rivals, also in a military sense, you do look differently at tech. Now, what is the solution there? How can one go about? Because China has concerns and they address their concerns, but how should the US address their concerns in the tech sphere, and how then link up with partners?
Right. So my view here is that, and I would imagine China would take a similar approach. I don't think there's anything unique about the United States, but my relatively simplistic idea is we should identify a relatively small number of technologies that clearly have military application. And we already do this. Our Defense Department doesn't buy serious hardware from any international suppliers. There are a couple of deals with very close allies, but in general, our Defense Department procures domestically for weaponry, and related the computer systems that run it, et cetera, et cetera. I would keep it pretty restricted because I think we benefit a lot from an open innovation system. And if we start saying, if we go too far back up the value chain, we don't want semiconductors to be traded. I think that's not realistic. I mean, what will happen is the US may have some fleeting advantage, but you've got other major players like Korea and European firms. And basically, for most of these, the US is just shutting itself out of commercial opportunities, and others are going to step in. So you're not really doing anything in terms of retarding China's technological advance. So I don't have sympathy for trying to retard another country's overall technological advance. I have sympathy for walling off a relatively small part of the economy that's key to national security.
Again, related, one aspect that we haven't discussed yet is the intellectual exchange between China and the United States. And that has been quite severely affected by visa policies and otherwise. Professor Christine Wong is asking, how do you see that evolve, and how does Biden think about that? And will we get a renaissance of those contacts that are important in some aspects for China?
Right. So I think it's really unfortunate that the virus hit, basically at the same time that we were having this trade and technology war between the US and China. So there is kind of an identification problem. I do think most of the curtailment of collaboration and exchange is a result of the pandemic. Obviously, some of that still continues, over the internet, but it's not really, in terms of research collaboration, I think working over the internet is not a substitute for working together. So as we get the virus under control, I would expect there to be a fairly significant bounce back in terms of scientific exchange, research exchange, et cetera. Plus, I do think the Biden team, in a lot of these areas, the end result is going to be, the Trump administration sort of took 2 steps in one direction. Biden will take 1 step back. But that's kind of very personal assessment of where we're likely to get after a year or so. If you listen to the cabinet appointees, they're all, basically arguing that there's not going to be any quick change in the policies toward China, and they have said some fairly aggressive things about various Chinese policies. So it's a little bit speculative on my part that as the virus gets under control and as the world returns a little bit more towards normal and the US returns a little bit politically toward normal, and to take a concrete thing, Bert, I mean, the Biden team is definitely talking about rolling back some of the ideas about students that had come from the Trump administration. So I don't think we'll end up with anywhere near the kind of restrictions that were in the works.
Well, that's very good news. You discussed the domestic necessity for innovation driving productivity and then driving growth. But to paraphrase Solo, there's lots of innovation going on in China, except you see it everywhere except in the statistics. That's not just a China problem, but it is basically a global problem, in part actually because of the global financial crisis. But Yongpo An asks, so what can China do to translate more of that innovation into productivity? What are the steps that are needed, and maybe that applies also to other countries?
Right. So not an easy question. I come back to the fact that I think 95% of patents in China are awarded to the private sector. And I think a lot of people don't know this, is a pretty significant share of patents in China are awarded to, foreign researchers, basically. You've got a lot of and actually collaboration. You've got a lot of patents where you've got somebody from the US and somebody from China, or somebody from Europe, somebody from China, et cetera. Anyway, I just have more confidence. I don't think the private sector magically does everything well. I think they do a lot of things poorly, particularly if you don't have appropriate regulation. But I do think innovation, commercial innovation is done more successfully by the private sector. Basic research needs to be funded by the government. I don't know enough about the details in China. But my suspicion is there's probably not enough balance with the government financing basic research that's made available, as public knowledge, versus commercial research done by private companies that have confidence in their intellectual property rights.
It's actually, I mean, in China, the vast majority is private or non-state, I should say. So not that much comes from government coffers, but of course there is a gray area where the government guided funds mix with non-state funds, and so it's actually quite hard to disentangle. But if you look at the statistics, the majority is private. But that may also in part be an issue. I mean, you see low productivity of R&D investments, if you want, and one question came from that regarding to that in Huawei you see quite low productivity of the investments made. So lots of publications, lots of patents, but they're not worth that much. So that's one of the issues that probably China needs to work on. Sarah Tong has, and we just put it as a statement, Sarah Tong has it as a statement that, look, there's a real tension between China sort of focus on the state enterprises and the state, whereas in the end, this translation of innovation into productivity has to come a lot from the private sector. So I think that is a tension that remains and won't necessarily be resolved in the very, very short run. We touched upon a lot of issues on China. If you were to be able to whisper to Xi Jinping, what would be your three priorities in policies for the next 5-year plan? And Lu Xiangyan has raised this question.
Well, partly it's a kind of there's always an issue about how you package things, but I guess I do, I do think that the various steps you would have to take to really eliminate the household registration system everywhere, and kind of open up more migration, more movement of people. I actually think that's quite important. And then while it's closely related, I think, really ensuring you've got good basic education, starting with pre-K. I worried about this issue that most of the children seem to be going to school in the countryside. So I think the combination of putting resources into rural education and health, and then the freeing up the hukou system. If you're serious, urban locations are going to have to put a lot more into dealing with migrant children. And then I get a third one. The funny is, normally, Bert, my knee-jerk third one would be opening up the economy more. But I'm pretty impressed by what's happened with RCEP. Pretty impressed by what's happened with RCEP and the European Treaty. So I guess if I were picking a third one, it would come back to the innovation regime. So intellectual property rights protection, but I'm sure there's a lot more behind that in terms of government funding of basic research. And part of the blockage for the private companies may be, it strikes me, you've got lots of dynamic small and medium firms in China. And now we've had these very small number of high profile successful firms like Huawei, Alibaba, Tencent. I know the whole story around Jack Ma and Alibaba is complicated, but that's not a good sign that regulatory changes were made that wiped out about a third of his wealth. I do think it's difficult to be a large firm in China, and you need a balance of small and large. I don't want to glorify the large, but I don't think China has enough large private enterprises.
Yeah, it wiped out a little bit of my wealth as well. Fortunately, I'm not as rich as Jack Ma, because the damage would have been a lot bigger. But we are coming to actually two questions, and Gunther DeFay and Jonathan Woodsell are asking similar questions, and that's about the risks. So is it housing, is it finance, is it a lack of liberalization? What are the key risks for China's growth going forward, and the realistic risk? You can always make up risk, but what are the key risks that you see?
I mean, in general, I'm optimistic about the Chinese economy. So I think, they're not going to get an A+ in dealing with all the policy issues I talked about, but they'll do pretty well. And they've got enough positives going. There's still a lot of catch-up potential. And while there's diminishing returns to capital, still investment matters, and they're turning out those STEM graduates, et cetera. So I think it's close to inevitable as anything is in economics that they'll be the biggest economy in the world 10 years, 12 years down the road. It's hard to pinpoint exactly. So I'm relatively optimistic. If I were thinking of, the cliche is to say the risks in the financial system, which I think are fairly significant, but their technocrats are really qualified and have managed that pretty well. So I guess if I were thinking of a realistic risk, it would be that for various reasons, they really open up the whole financial system. I should be clear, when I talk about opening, I'm thinking more about direct investment, trade, opening up the whole system to unrestrained capital flows. A lot of developing countries have come to grief over that. And, I've never been a big advocate of completely opening up the capital account until, you have a really sophisticated, robust financial system. I think China's still away. So there's a risk that they would kind of miscalculate and for some various reasons open up financially and end up getting some seriously destabilizing capital flows. But even then, I would think they would correct and bounce back relatively quickly.
Well, one part of that, and we haven't discussed that yet, is part of this opening up the capital account, being, if you want, a necessary step for internationalization of the RMB. And maybe internationalization of the RMB started as more of a prestige project, but now increasingly you can see it as if you want a more structural issue. There's tensions always around the dollar-dominated payment system, and the Trump administration threatened at some point to exclude Chinese players from that. They've excluded other players, including in Iran and others. So they used it as basically as a diplomatic as a diplomatic tool, and so this would then drive the internationalization of the RMB. What do you see as the prospects for this?
Right. So I think that's a nice way of phrasing it, Bert. So from a purely economic point of view, the internationalization of the renminbi is not moving that quickly. Like all this lending they're doing for BRI, for example, they're doing all that in US dollars and euros, basically. And, for a variety of reasons, they don't want their currency to truly be in freely exchanged international currency. But I think you put your finger on, why might they change? And it would be because of continuing political tension with the United States, feeling that relying on the dollar system put them at a disadvantage. And I think it wouldn't necessarily lead, one scenario is you end up getting some kind of financial crisis because that's hard to manage. But I think a different real sector risk would be that really is the beginning, of the world bifurcating, into a US bloc and a China bloc, with all kinds of countries put in an awkward position. I personally, I just think that would be a terrible world. But partly because we, you've got so many Asian countries that are in some sense pretty close security allies of the US, somewhat integrated with the US economy, but more integrated with the Chinese economy. So I think that that could be a recipe for, if there's slow growth in Asia, there's going to be slow growth for the world economy. So I think that would be a serious political risk. I can't hear you, Bert.
Sorry about that. It's getting quite late, so I'm going towards the final question for you. That's a broader question. I mean, we are in 2021. The first centennial is on its way. China will be moderately prosperous by July. But a lot of countries, of course, as you started, are looking at this at China's development success. Now, Hannah Brixey asked the question: so what can other developing countries, but particularly African countries, what can they learn from China, and what should they not learn from China? Maybe also.
So I think because Africa is divided into more than 50 different countries, that serious priority for Africa is continental integration, which is hard to do. I understand that with all those different countries, but China used to have its provinces were actually each kind of mini self-sufficient economies. There were trade barriers between provinces. You remember this, Bert, and that was an important part of their reform that we don't talk about that much, I think, is that they really created national markets, for goods and services. We're not quite there yet for labor, but pretty good for capital. So I think creating a big internal market is important. And then secondly, probably the most important lesson is then opening that big internal market to international competition and international specialization. And then and I've worked in quite a few developing countries, and this may seem very basic or almost simplistic, but you have an orderliness in China, where you can go about life and go about business, and I happen to think I don't think it's necessarily related to authoritarianism. So I don't think African countries should, take the lesson that you need an authoritarian government to create order. But I do think, kind of, basic law and order, civility, trustworthiness, all of these things, I don't think we know how to generate these things. But when they're not present, I look back at some of the mistakes the World Bank has made, for example, and I don't think it was a bad advice to encourage a lot of countries to open up to international trade, but I do think we tended to overemphasize or overestimate what benefits countries were going to get, because we looked at Asian societies that had a lot of different things going for them in terms of education and rule of law and various things. And also they opened up to the world economy. And then we took that last lesson saying, well, if you open up to the world economy, you can grow like these Asian economies growing at 10%. And actually they just had a lot more foundation. They're overdetermined.
All right, thank you, David. David, this was a wonderful talk, and we had a very good Q&A. I will send Hannah another paper that I actually did on lessons from China. And lesson number 1 was there is no China model, because China was so idiosyncratic in its development, but knew how to apply lessons from abroad in this particular circumstance, in a particular time. I think that's the key lesson to take from China. But the key lesson from you, David, that is that China is likely to continue to grow quite rapidly, and according to its views, you see a lowering of the temperature between China and the U.S. and some cooperation maybe blooming again, and that is in the end good for the world economy and good for the recovery of us all. So thank you so much for your insights. So it was a great joy to see you again, great joy to have you here. And we had more than 230 people at the peak of the discussion. So I'm sure many of them will join me in thanking you and wishing you a good night.
Thank you, Bert. Really a pleasure. Great questions. Great hearing you and old friends.